Chapter 9. The Micheaux Legacy. The data collected for this work allows readers and researchers to view Oscar Micheaux as either victim or victor. This writer has chosen to view Micheaux as a victor, without necessarily viewing him as a hero. The term hero suggests that a consensus of the filmmaker's peers and his public had respect and admiration for Micheaux. Evidence reveals that for different reasons, Micheaux had a substantial number of detractors, primarily African American intellectuals and clergy and white censors. Inasmuch as Micheaux was able to prevail over the objections of these three influential groups and live his life doing what he enjoyed, namely writing and filmmaking, he was victorious. He was able to succeed within the constraints of his environment. Racial, financial, intellectual, and religious. All those things that he stated he would do, he did to the maximum degree that he could. He used the full breadth of his talents as a promoter and entrepreneur to accomplish his goals. He held his own in an industry where greed and cutthroat tactics were not uncommon. Surely his survival in such an arena suggests that he had to operate on a similar level, sometimes if only to protect his own interests. For these reasons, it's doubtful that Micheaux could ever be called hero. But heroism has never been the lure of the motion picture industry. The film business was and is a way to entertain, to make social statements, and to make money. Micheaux's criticisms of his own race might lead the reader to wonder if the filmmaker had racial identity problems. The writer concludes that the opposite was true. Throughout Micheaux's life, he articulated a strong sense of racial pride in his books and films. He was very much against racial arrogance of any kind. He refused to use the film medium for the kind of racial counter-propaganda African American intellectuals wanted. In literature, African American writers had effectively used counter-propaganda as a response to white Southern apologist authors who portrayed the Old South and slavery as a mythical paradise for African Americans and whites. African American writers, in turn, used their talents to present the noble side of their race while portraying whites as stereotypically cruel and dumb. In effect, African American writers were using the same techniques to build a case against racism that the white writers used to build a case for it. They were reacting to their environment in kind. When film emerged as a popular pastime, it became another new medium that was used to portray African Americans in an unflattering light. African American leaders naturally expected that an African American filmmaker would and should respond as African American writers had, using counter-propaganda. Hugh Gloster reported that a large number of Negroes, rendered hypersensitive by years of discrimination and oppression, shrink from anything other than a flattering portrayal of the race. This argument continues into modern times. What recent film or television show portraying African American life has not met with sharp criticism from some African Americans if the characters are not positive and flattering? Gloster also reported 4 fallacies that author Sterling Brown attributed to the criticisms of African American books by African American readers. 1. African Americans look upon black books, regardless of the author's intention, as representative of all African Americans, such as sociological documents. 2. African Americans insist that black books must be idealistic, optimistic tracks for race advertisement. 3. African Americans are afraid of truth-telling, of satire. 4. African Americans criticize from the point of view of bourgeois America, of racial apologists. These same fallacies were and are applicable to African American viewers' criticisms of films about African Americans, particularly those made by a black filmmaker. This one-sided viewpoint was held by African American intellectuals, and it obscured Micheaux's intent. It completely overlooked Micheaux's biographical writings, where he championed black pride even to the point of giving up the woman he loved because she was not African American. It ignored his early articles pleading for an African American enterprise. In his later years, his novels were full of biting criticism of America's racially hypocritical society and the images of African Americans presented on film and radio. These things were ignored by black intellectuals. They did not understand that Micheaux was unique as one of the first filmmakers, black or white, to expand the film image of the African American man from buffoon to bourgeoisie. He offered the viewer a range and diversity of blackness. In addition to clowns and villains, Micheaux gave audiences African American cowboys, adventurers, detectives, millionaires, and a host of other gallant roles in which they had not previously been shown. In criticizing African Americans, he seemed to view himself as some self-proclaimed savior of his race, whose duty was to point out weaknesses in the lives of African Americans in order to motivate them to improve. It was inevitable that black intellectuals would feel as they did. Today, criticism of the African American clergy is not uncommon, particularly among younger generations. Some have gone beyond Micheaux's charges of hypocrisy and greed, and also accuse religious leaders of simply being out of touch with reality and the need of the African American masses for forceful leadership in effecting social change. Micheaux was a man ahead of his time in daring to assail them for that weakness. Unfairly, he allowed his own unfortunate experiences with some to color his view of the entire profession. Other themes of his progressive and melodramatic films after 1920 included wife abuse, the evils of city life, passing for white, miscegenation, African American vice and nightlife, white oppression of African Americans, and events right off the headlines of American newspapers. An unsophisticated public was unable to accept the full force of such efforts or the manner in which he presented them. Micheaux's life, from 1884 to 1918, was primarily idealistic, but also adventurous and ambitious. He believed in the American dream and refused to accept the fact that his skin color rendered much of that dream beyond his reach. He expended tremendous energy trying to prove to himself and other African Americans that hard work brought fame and fortune to the dedicated. It is incredible that his first 3 novels appear to completely ignore the racial oppression in America at the time. Micheaux's first film, The Homesteader, gave him instant celebrity status among African Americans in 1919. He offered them a chance to see themselves in a romantic adventure at a time when they had begun to despair about their negative screen image and the difficult life in America's northern ghettos and rural South. The bloody race riots in the United States during the latter half of 1919 turned Micheaux's idealism to realism. His home base of Chicago had been the scene of some of the worst rioting amid this kind of turmoil. Micheaux also found out that white distributors would not market films by an African American man. He was allowed to show his work only at African American theaters, which were often located right in the middle of areas under attack by white marauders. The resulting loss of revenues, coupled with the onset of a national recession, put Micheaux in a precarious financial position, despite a peak popularity of black films among African Americans from 1919 to 1921. During this realistic phase of his life, he used film to make biting commentary not only about black social life and the clergy, but also on white racism in the South and North. He also began to film works by African American and white novelists other than himself. His approach was offensive to many, but the African American movie-going public went to see his work. White censors were particularly hard on Micheaux. They often tried to ban his work, supposedly out of fear that when African Americans saw his films, there would be a repeat of the racial violence that had plagued so many American cities. In many of his battles with the censor boards, particularly at the beginning of his film career, Micheaux was victorious. This was primarily due to the additional support of prominent African American and white citizen groups who argued for his right to freedom of speech. Those highly publicized hearings usually resulted in packed houses on opening night and gave the censors constant agitation on behalf of Micheaux's defense. He lost, however, many of the censorship battles strictly on moral grounds. Scenes of gambling or love-making, especially between African Americans and those presumed to be white, though they really weren't, were often ordered cut. These legal battles were long and costly, adding severe strain on Micheaux's already weakened financial position. Employee dishonesty and irresponsibility, a shrinking distribution network, and continuing money problems forced Micheaux into bankruptcy in 1928. As sound movies developed and Hollywood focused on the new popularity of African Americans as a fad, West Coast movie moguls produced African American films of far superior technical quality than those of Micheaux and other independent filmmakers. Unable to effectively compete in such an arena, his audiences dwindled in favor of products from the major studios. Micheaux entered the final stage of his life as a survivalist, disenchanted, but refusing to give up filmmaking despite growing encroachment on his market by the Hollywood movie industry. He made remakes of his earlier successes, continued to shoot originals, and finally became the first African American man to premiere his film on Broadway in 1948. The film was a critical failure. Micheaux died in 1951. Lorenzo Tucker, the Black Valentino, recalled Micheaux fondly. "He was like a father to me. When I was broke, I could always eat dinner with him and his wife. Whenever he was in Philadelphia, he always visited my mother and stepfather to tell them I was fine in New York." Tucker met Micheaux during the second phase of the filmmaker's life, the realistic yet ambitious period. Tucker described Micheaux as stern, compulsive, precise, and pompous. The actor said, "He didn't like to rehearse. He used to say, 'If it don't look good on film, I'll cut it out.'" Micheaux also had other idiosyncrasies. He never learned to drive, so he used a chauffeur. He always wore a wide-rimmed African-American-styled hat and ate Argo starch. Tucker viewed Micheaux as one who showed the Negro as he is. Carlton Moss met Micheaux in the third phase of the filmmaker's life, the survivalistic period. He recalled the racism that Micheaux sometimes encountered at the film processors when he accompanied him there. He also recalled problems with crew members who drank on the job. Moss saw Micheaux as a short-fused and pressured man of 250 pounds who seemed to melt whenever his wife, Alice B. Russell, asked, "Is everything all right, Dad?" Indeed, it was Mrs. Micheaux who had introduced Moss to the filmmaker. Moss remembered her to be a very prim and proper lady who typed the scripts and gently corrected her husband's frequent misuse of the English language. Moss also recalled the negative attitude some actors expressed about Micheaux, owing to his non-payment of their fees. He spoke freely about the views of African American intellectuals on Micheaux. They ignored him. He was a joke to them. They said he did not establish any artistry with his work. He had no creativity in their opinion. He did the same story over and over. The big moguls in Hollywood always paid for artistry despite their faults. Micheaux didn't. He was a small man with a big idea, ever testing out theories on African American people that he learned from reading how whites had succeeded. Yet Moss did not want to underestimate Micheaux's achievements. The odds were 99.5 to 1 against him, but he got out there. Why, he would write books and travel up and down the stairs in Harlem in order to raise money for a film. When he got into the movie business, African Americans were already cut out, just like everybody else. It was a cutthroat business from the beginning. You need a chemist, an optics man, and distributors to be a success in it. He had none of that, and the Johnsons did, Lincoln Motion Picture Company. They also had money and walked a middle-of-the-road line, not stepping on any toes. Yet Micheaux outdid them. He was driven, and he kept at it. If Oscar Micheaux had had money, he could have relaxed some of his demons. This work is significant in two important ways. It presents the most comprehensive overview of Micheaux's life and work that is known, and it presents the most up-to-date filmography known to exist on Micheaux's work. The investigation of Micheaux's life which is offered in these pages is a response to Bernard L. Peterson's call for more scholarly research than he was able to present in 1985. The writer of this work now offers this more complete foundation of Micheaux's life for yet another scholar to build upon. Much of Micheaux's early life as a Pullman porter, farmer, and businessman remains a mystery. Similarly, Micheaux's personal life, his marriages, family ties, and interaction with other African Americans of the period needs closer inspection. His international dealings in South America and Europe should be carefully researched also. His writings need to be properly cataloged. In addition to 7 published and 3 unpublished novels known to have been written by Micheaux, this study has concluded that a strong possibility exists that Micheaux wrote at least 4 other short stories or novels from which he made films. These works are The Policy Players, alias Jefferson Lee, Jeff Ballinger's Woman, a rewrite of The Policy Players, and Naomi, Negress, which served as the basis for the following films: Spider's Web, 1926 and 27, The Wages of Sin, 1928 and 29, The Girl from Chicago, 1932, and God's Stepchildren, 1937 and 38, was a remake of Spider's Web. Micheaux's track record for giving credit to authors whose work he filmed was generally exemplary, even when he had drastically changed the work from its written story. Micheaux is also known to have frequently left his name off his books when he sold them to other African Americans because African Americans often refused to buy books written by one of their own during that period. Based on the data collected, Oscar Micheaux emerged in this study as a rugged, if not stubborn, individualist. He was a man of his own principles and an innovative and creative businessman more than an artist. He did not resist progress, but his limited resources allowed some progress to pass by him. Within the world that was available to him, he utilized every resource. He filmed the world as he saw and experienced it, and he grew to be a particularly astute observer of the world over time. Oscar Micheaux has left a legacy worth noting, yet as of this writing, only a half-dozen of his sound films and none of his silent works are in the Library of Congress. He was a man whose accomplishments merit further research. Research should continue until all of his films have been cataloged or the ones which are noted in this work are certified to be a complete list. Here was a man who fought to make the American dream a reality throughout his entire life. In the film documentary, Were You There?, B. Freeman, Micheaux's Sepia Mae West, says, Oscar Micheaux's films should be looked at as a beginning, a great first step to greater things. This work on Oscar Micheaux is but a first step upon which it is hoped other scholars may build the path to a fair place for Micheaux in the history of America, films, and African Americans. This much he is due.